this very exciting panel. I was really thrilled when Games for Change invited me to develop this panel because of just my passion for the role that I believe that games can have in overall human growth and development. And so with that, we'll just get right in. As mentioned, this panel is Worldgames, transferring commercial in-game benefits to life. I'm the executive director and co-founder of the Transformative Tech Lab, and we incubate and focus on founders who are developing what we call well-being tech. I'm joined by Brie, who is the CEO and creative director of True Love, a Toronto-based studio making AI companions, and Chethan Ramachandran, who is the co-founder and CEO of Skillprint. Just to get us started, I want to give you the why of this panel. Why are we here? One of the things that is facing us is that if you think about the world today, all of our crises are on exponential curves. All of our technology is on exponential curves, but human growth and development is actually still linear. Meanwhile, about 2.8 billion people are playing games. It makes a lot of sense that we can use games not only for change, but also for human transformation itself. The process of how we learn to become healthy, happy human adults, how we go through the process of understanding and answering the big questions about who we are, how we feel, how do we become. And one of the really critical parts of that is not just enjoying games, and that there's certainly a role for that, and not just, teaching traditional concepts inside of games, and there's certainly a role for that. But the idea that the digital and the physical worlds are actually one world, and we can use games to transfer benefits from the digital world into the real. And so with that, the two cases that we're going to dive deeply into are two companies that I love so very much for what they are doing. One company is the Modern Strengths Finder, and that's Skillprint, which you'll hear more about. The rising generations need to know what they're great at, and you're going to hear an amazing example of a company that's doing that. And then the Modern Compassion Builder, and how to flip the script on how we think about what is motivation in games, that then both pulls skills into the real world. So with that as a start, you're in for a real treat, and we're going to have a deep discussion, and we actually have time to really get in. So with that, I've asked each of the panelists to give you an overview of what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how it transfers to the real world. So with that, we're going to start with Brie. Brie?
Them and complain about work, and they would say, yeah, you should, why are you doing that? Quit and go back to school and become an industrial designer or an interior designer. Things that were more relevant to them and that they thought would make me happier. But I knew that there was something in interactivity that really drew me, and that I wished I could share it with them. And I guess around 2014-ish, when the console generation switched and tablets became popular, my friends started to come to me separately from each other and ask, what are video games? Is there something I should be playing? And I was really excited and thought I would be able to finally share this thing with them. And I started to suggest different games, and I found, interestingly, that they still weren't interested. And still, from what they were saying, I had a hunch that I couldn't put words on. But I have a cousin who is an art historian and contemporary artist. She's interested in contemporary feminist art, and she goes to art openings, and she's not interested in games whatsoever. And I suggested to her that she play Skyrim. And she looked it up and texted me back and said, why would I play this? I don't like Game of Thrones. I'm not interested in this, and I don't understand why you're recommending it to me. And I had recommended to her previously games that were more in line with her taste, so it was a departure, but I felt like it wouldn't be a departure on the mechanical level. or on the emotional level. So I didn't hear from her for about 2 weeks, and I thought she didn't play it, but then 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from her, and we don't phone each other, we text. And at the time, I had a phobia about the phone, so I figured if she's phoning, it's something really serious. And I answered, and she was crying, and she said, Lydia died. And she had been playing Skyrim constantly for 2 weeks. And she didn't know anything. She didn't know how the controls work. She didn't know any of the ways that video games work, but she had managed to do quite a few things and develop a really strong attachment to Lydia, and accidentally had killed her and didn't have a save game for a long time, and she was really upset. And in that conversation, I learned that all these years that she didn't like video games, she didn't know what they were. She really thought that they were just fighting and winning and shooting. And she didn't realize that you could develop an emotional connection to a character in a game. And a lot of that experience really stuck with me. And I started to think about what I like in games, and I realized that everything that I like is not what the game was designed to do. I use the game, it's kind of like when you see like two roads and then there's someone has walked through the garden enough times that there's like a path through the garden that no one is using. I mean, everyone is using, but you're not supposed to. And that's the way that I play games. So like when I played RTS games a lot when I was young, the part of the game that I liked was clicking on the characters and seeing what they're saying and taking care of the base and like trying to use as few resources as I could while still winning because I felt bad cutting down trees. And I realized that there's something else that's drawing me that's very different than what we're designing for and different than everything I've learned at work. And I started to read and look everywhere, and I figured out what it is, which is that the gamification curve that we often use is built on a sense of rising tension over time, that we make something harder and harder and harder, and that this leverages our fight or flight response to stress. And so does Western narrative structure and guitar solos and other forms of entertainment. But we assume that something needs to start with a sense of shock or danger or challenge. And this will lead us to go into this fight or flight response with some adrenaline in the body, which makes you instinctively want to win. And then the game designer provides opportunities for you to win. And that feels great if that's your response to stress. But about half of people, or all of us about half the time, or somewhere in between there, have a different response to stress, discovered later in 2000 at the UCLA Social Neuroscience Lab, called Tend and Befriend. And this, instead of adrenaline, is oxytocin, which some people would call the love hormone. It's a bit of a simplification. But it doesn't make you instinctively want to win. It makes you instinctively want to take care of people or things who are more vulnerable than you, seek out your friends or your allies or make new friends, and find solutions that work for everyone. Behaviors of care and connection instead of domination. And this explains all of my previous game playing behavior. And it made me wonder, does that mean that the assumption that we put players in a flow state by creating this curve of rising tension could mean that we could create a flow state by making curves or waves or something of deepening connection? So I tested that in a little app with my studio that we put out 2 years ago. And we put many different little mini games in the app that tested the idea of curves of some type of deepening connection, some kind of metaphor for connection. So instead of the experiences going from easy to hard, they go from awkward to smooth, disconnected to connected, empty to full. Any metaphor we could think of that seemed to resonate with us that might seem like you're getting more and more connected with something. And it turns out it works. We weren't expecting it to work right away. We thought we would need to work really hard to get a few thousand audience members. We call them tenders instead of players, to get a few thousand tenders and iterate with them and their feedback to figure out what was here. But instead, we had 500,000 downloads in the first 6 weeks with no advertising. And we were flooded with feedback from our audience members saying things that we would want to hear in our wildest dreams, and using language that was so clear. Like, I feel as if the little avatar is looking out for me as much as I am looking out for them, even though the experience is super simple, and echoes the emotional connection that my cousin had for Lydia, even though Lydia doesn't even say much. Or it's the most calming app I have. I feel as if it puts me in a trance. So building on that, now we're working on an AI that builds on some of the same principles, drawing on game AI mostly, but instead of creating a relationship over time where the player feels like they get like more and more badass or becomes some kind of very powerful being in this world, the relationship that occurs over time is one of deepening friendship. So we think a lot about what is friendship, what is a non-hierarchical relationship where you create mutually beneficial outcomes. A friend is someone we think who knows you maybe even better than you know yourself, who gives you little nudges towards how you can become more of who you are, and who joins you in doing the things that you love to do. Nichol, I can't hear you.
Oh, I had turned off my microphone for a second. I love everyone. I love this product so much. We're going to have a deep Q&A session between the three of us as the second part of the panel. And, you know, some of the questions that I'm going to ask you in there, Brie, is like, you know, at the time, I think one of the things that's so amazing is at the time that you know, developed this and started or came up with this question, it was so against the grain, so against the grain of what the world thought games should be and what they thought the loops were, that, you know, it's like you you had to have been told you were crazy, and you had to have said, yeah, and I don't care, a
Yeah.
couple of times. Um, so I would love for you to just speak a little bit about courage. And then the other thing is, if you could just go a little bit deeper into, I'm really curious about the transference part, which is, you know, I feel like one of the things, and I love the game too. The experiences actually. I enjoy. I go into the experiences myself. Um, I would love you to speak a little bit about what the experiences can teach people about self-care and also friendship that translates into the real world.
Sure. Is that when we do the Q&A or right now?
Yeah, no, go ahead and do it right now because I'm just incredibly curious.
Both of those questions?
Yeah, just
Okay.
a little bit on courage.
Sure.
So we have about 2 minutes, a little bit on courage, and you know, and a little bit on transference.
Okay. So, like, when I decided to do this, I had cancer, and I think it's pretty normal that when you have an experience like that, that afterward life can become really crystal clear. And I knew that there were things I wanted to do with game AI that the industry wasn't doing. And I was like kind of looking for opportunities to do that throughout my career, but not enough that it ever came up. And after that, everything became very clear, and I knew what I wanted to contribute. And then I'm just very stubborn. So I tried every angle I could to be able to contribute that thing, and eventually got here. But there was many different, like, I tried many different approaches and hit many different walls, but I just always had always enough discovery that I felt like, I think this is true. I think it is true. Everyone's saying it's not, but I think it is true. And enough steps along the way to keep me going.
Great. And then just a little bit in the minute we have left before we switch to skill print, a little bit about transference, how the experience in game teaches people skills for the real world.
Yeah, I mean, play is how we naturally learn. You can look at any animal or any child or any child animal like a kitten and see that play is practice for life. And There's many things for us to practice, not just winning, but all of the skills that we want to use in life.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so we're going to transition now to skill print and Chethan. And we met at a conference, and when he told me what he was working on and what his idea was about what he wanted to create, I instantly said, and I don't know if you remember, I was, exactly what you're doing, and it's exactly what the world needs, and how I can help, what I can do, because it really truly is what the world needs. And so, with that, if you would share a little bit about what Skillprint does, where the idea came from, why you're doing it, and when everyone told you you were crazy, why you ignored them.
Sure. Yeah, that conference was the Brain Mind Conference at Stanford, I think, 2 years ago. And it was a conference of neuroscientists, and I'd shown up, talking about games. And Nichol was one of the few people there who just understood immediately why games were so important for how the mind worked. This is something that I've been thinking about for 10 years. My first company I started in 2009 was one of the earlier companies doing analytics in games. We tried to predict a lot of things about human behavior. For the game companies, it was stuff like lifetime value, cost of acquisition, all the really nitty-gritty tactical things game companies need to care about. But what we saw, even from some of the first data sets that we got through games, was we saw people's rich emotional lives coming out as they played. We saw people who were highly social, who just wanted to hang out with their friends. We saw in the same networks of folks, their friends who were highly competitive. And the social people didn't want to play with the competitive people because it just wasn't fun. And the competitive people only wanted to play with other competitive people because they just wanted to try to win. And, this is 2009 in social games, the silliest billiards game you can imagine. But all of a sudden, you started to see really rich fabric around the human mind. And so in that first company I had called Playnomics, we got really good at predicting the stuff that the game developers cared about, lifetime value and all that wonderful stuff. We sold to Unity in 2014, became Unity Analytics, saw 500 million unique users on a monthly basis by 2015. Now I think the product is tracking 1.5 billion unique users a month. So saw massive data at scale. But the thing that we kept seeing over and over again that I kept coming back to was all this amazing psychographic data around how the mind worked. And I just thought it was amazing that, in the silliest games you could think of, you would actually understand people. And so it was one of those things I kind of tucked away. I left Unity. I spent some time, and this is when we met Nichol, investing and advising around neuroscience. Every neuroscience lab I went to, every education lab I went to, were using games. And they were using games to try to predict, how does the mind work? Cognitive skills, attention, focus, task switching. Why are some people bold when some others are fearful? Why do people take risks, and what do those risks look like? Personality traits, things like grit, creativity, proactivity, and then knowledge and concepts. Can you actually measure things like critical thinking, collaboration, communication, and can you see them grow by people playing games, and can you then see how they've grown? And so I just found the whole thing fascinating, and I thought, well, if I keep thinking about it for 10 years, I've got to kind of do something about it. And at the same time, I'd sold a company. I was kind of sitting around thinking about what should I do with my life. And it really struck me that, like, if I was thinking about what should I do with my life, having done something and still not sure what I'm about in the world, most people are like that. And maybe all of us, at this conference, certainly maybe on this call, got lucky early on where we had the right mentor, the right education, the right pathing to tell us, hey, this is what you're meant to do. This is what makes you special and unique. This is what your hidden talents are. This is how you can unlock them. But I would argue that most people in the history of the world have never gotten that. And the structure by way you unlock who you are is very much one where gatekeepers are always there saying, no, you can't do this. no, you can't do this. This is for someone else. This is not for you. And so, we just thought, wouldn't it be amazing if you inverted the whole thing? What if you put people in charge of their whole destiny and made them, the stewards and the players in their own game? And so what we're basically doing is using games that we've made a few, but really we're trying to work with other people who have made games. We're trying to read those games to try to understand what those games can tell you about how the mind works. And then we're trying to put it in front of people in a very fun, engaging way where they can understand not only what they have hidden inside that they can grow upon, but they can understand what to do next, which is another big part of the puzzle. It's one thing to say, hey, you have the risk appetite of a race car driver. Next question is, how do you actually become a race car driver, right? And so putting those pieces together where, you tell someone, this is what you're meant to do in life, and this is how you can actually go do it on a step-by-step basis where you see progress. That's sort of the mission and vision of the company. I'll end with one quick thing, which is sort of the real reason I'm doing all of this was I played Halo for probably 6 months on end with a friend when I was unemployed, and he was unemployed probably in the early mid-2000s online. And we would spend hours trying to destroy each other. This is one of my best friends. We were double partners in high school tennis. I was best man at his wedding and vice versa. And one day he started beating me all the time. And I just couldn't take it. I'm a very competitive person. Hard for me to take losing, especially someone I know when we're evenly matched. And I stepped back and I said, what's happening here? What I realized was he had just decided to sit back in a corner of the map in Halo, very quietly, not move at all, and just watch for me, running around like a headless chicken, as I like to do in those kind of games. But then I realized, wow, his personality, this is how he plays tennis, this is how he lives life. He's very much this kind of like sit back and wait and see what happens kind of person. So once I realized that, I altered my personality in the game to pretend like I didn't know what he was doing. And now 10 years later, he's never beaten me since, and he has no idea why. But hopefully he's not watching this. Otherwise, he might figure it out. But to me, even in the Halo, if something as silly as a first-person shooter can bring out people's real personalities, that means that what we're doing in these games is very meaningful. It has real impact in the world. And now is the time to sort of turn the idea of what games are on its head and to really tell people this is very different than what you thought it was. And what if, these games where people think generally people are wasting time are actually the most meaningful use of their time? And I'll include, sort of Brie has mentioned that she doesn't consider her stuff kind of a game. Broadly speaking, interactive entertainment, game-like functions, these are where you really start to see how people really act. And I think that's just the most meaningful thing, that could be out there right now.
Yeah, one of the things that I do is that whenever I have the opportunity to make an avatar look like myself, I always do it. Like I always do it. It doesn't matter what genre it is. If I can make the skin brown and the hair long, I just always do it. And so, there's another product that I really love that's called Jensen 8. And what they're doing is they have, it's kind of like a digital escape room. And what they've done, which is really a great integration of product, is that the HR trainers who are doing leadership and development, L&D in corporations, they're in God mode, watching the teams play. And what they have found, and the teams do things like the space station is about to explode, or like something that is about to happen, and they watch them in God mode, and it turns out that people play exactly the way that they live. They play exactly the way that they live, or at least for sure the way they act in the office. So one of the things that happens is the information hoarder, like hoards information in the game too. They don't confer with other people. They don't like that person in the office. That's how they play. And then, or, the person who, doesn't want to test anything and runs ahead and does that on teams. They do that in the game too. The person who is too tentative, who, you know, can't make a decision until it's too late. They do that in the game as well. And so a couple of things that are interesting too is that maybe the first or second time people do what's expected of them, which is one of the challenges in you know, learning and development in corporations, that people start to play the role that they think. Like if they're playing the leader role, then they act more leaderly for that 2.5 day offsite. And then when they get back to the office and their desk and their, you know, their cup of coffee, you know, their coffee cup that changes when it gets hot, as soon as they get back in their environment, they go back to the person that they were before. But when people play, they can fake play for a couple of times, but around round 3 to 8, they become the person, or they revert to the behavior that they have in the real world. And so, you know, with Jensen 8, the trainers are watching and they're in God mode, and they immediately start coaching the team. And so now one of the things that's been interesting is that some of the places where they've been set up, the corporations are asking for permanent rigs, and they do it in sort of like an 8 rig, are asking for permanent rigs because teams are coming up against problems and deciding and wanting to go play together in order to come back and solve it again. So that's an interesting example. And then one more example that I'll share before we go into the group Q&A with the three of us is one of the games that I'm incredibly excited about is I love Hellblade. I really do. And because I meditate a lot, and a big focus of what I do is well-being technology, and people don't necessarily know that my definition of well-being is mental and emotional well-being, social and emotional wellness, and human potential and performance. Basically, it's happy, healthy internal landscape. And what that means is it doesn't mean that we avoid conflict. It doesn't mean that. Like, humans have to learn how to choose. And so they have to have conflict experiences to know if they don't like that, or to become good at it so they can navigate it well. So I'm an advocate of a huge range of games and possibilities. And one of the things that I really love about Hellblade is that the first one, because the lead character is someone who is experiencing schizophrenia, and they do it and they make it medically accurate. But, you know, it's in the distant past. You know, if you can imagine, like, if you play that game, you have what is a challenging experience. And it's one of those things that if you don't have that experience, there's no way you can understand it. You know, they're like, you can read about it, but you can't understand it. And even if you have someone in your life who has that experience, you still can't understand it. And I'm not suggesting playing a game is the same as having that experience, but it brings you a little bit closer to understanding it a bit than, you know, just sort of observing it from the outside.
Well, yeah, I mean, games are highly
Bradford,
experiential. I mean, that's sort of the point, right? Like the fact that games are so experiential is the reason that learning happens. And so, riffing off your corporate example in L&D, you know, we have a relationship with the UC Davis Personality Self and Emotion Lab, and they actually encouraged us to create a bunch of different scenarios for personality testing where, in one sense, you're doing very realistic things, and you kind of see how people would act in an office. Who doesn't fill up, you know, the coffee maker after using up all the coffee? And then the other scenarios they encouraged us to do were very fantastical situations where people are kind of looking at their idealized self. But between both of those poles, you know, sort of like how you'd act normally, your idealized self, you get a ton of range of information around where someone is and where they can go. And then you actually start to see in a lot of these situations, if people have never been exposed to risk-taking, for example, and now all of a sudden they're doing scenarios and experiences which are about risk-taking over and over again, they start to think about risk in a very, very different way. One of the folks that's on the board for Games for Change, Dr. Lynn Phelan at Yale School of Medicine, has a series of medically oriented games that are designed to help kids understand the pricing of risk so that they'll avoid things like heroin. And the games have nothing to do with heroin or drug dealing or anything. It's just about risk. But the more you're exposed in your mind, in its plasticity, is exposed to the ideas that risk is something. Here's how you price it. Here's how you understand it. The more your mind starts to think about it. So I actually think that growing through games, growing your sort of emotional landscape is the future. It's not just assessing where someone is and who they can work with and whether they're going to fill up the coffee maker at work or not. It's like, not only that, it's where can you go and can the games actually take you there?
Yeah, I agree with you. So here's a question to you both. One of the reasons why I admire you both so much is because you are constantly challenging assumptions. So in this place of skills accruing, things that we learn in game accruing, benefits from game accruing to the real world, where are the other places that we should challenge assumptions? Like, as long as we're challenging assumptions, like, where else should we do it? And then after you both answer that, I'd love you each to ask each other a question, a burning question.
So my own personal thoughts after seeing what I've seen with our product and what I've seen grow out of the games industry, the games industry figured out that it's interesting to make experiences that are driven by conflict, and then we came up with a model for interaction that then became the gamification model and influenced the design of apps and social media in general, but tends to pull mostly on these feelings of conflict. And I wonder if that means that most of our interface to the internet is built on feelings of conflict, which I agree with you are completely necessary and valid, but it's only part of the human experience, and one that we maybe are over-representing in our interface to the internet. And does that, at scale, influence us to be more conflictual with each other? I think it's something that we should be thinking about.
Wow. You are absolutely right. It's one of those things, like when people talk about human nature, the prevalence of what people think about sort of, Darwinism and competition and all of that. Actually, there is a longer human history of altruism, generosity,
Yes.
the willingness to sacrifice for people in one's genetic group, like in our ancestors. So, we haven't even yet gotten to the mechanisms that unlock the higher human nature.
Yeah.
And there's actually more of that in us than the
Yeah.
other part, because every single human left alive today had an ancestor who knew how to collaborate.
Yes.
And anyone who didn't, all of those people are gone. So, we all have that, and it's about time we make products that help us really go into that nature. Oh, you're amazing. Okay.
You actually had that in the early internet, right? Like in the bulletin boards and stuff like that. You had a much more collaborative human, kind of warmth around, and then unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, now you have Twitter, and
True.
It's a different world. I'll go with
Chethan, your assumption?
Yeah, I'll go with education, and this is kind of close to what we're doing, but it's something I've been diving into a lot. And I have an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old, and they've been doing Zoom classes, and it's something I think we all know, but it's caused me to question the nature of education in general. Where if you think about what we learn, it's a lot of what people call crystallized knowledge. Facts, figures, sort of mechanisms and stuff that is things that you can repeat, in rote mechanism over and over again. But I think the truth is that learning is about learning, and learning to learn is the whole point. So, the entire education system is completely backwards, completely upside down, in that it doesn't start with the fundamentals of here's how you learn to learn. once you learn to learn, you can learn anything that can be crystallized, and you can go be, you know, an architect or an engineer or whatever the case may be. But without the foundational understanding of, you know, how to learn, you're just flying blind. And for, you know, a lot of reasons, no one has been able to crack that and to do it on a highly personalized basis. I think that's the other problem, is that, you know, so I would just say, you know, learning in school is completely useless right now. Kids, go build video games, et cetera, et cetera.
You know, absolutely, absolutely. A friend of mine, his kid is in front of Zoom from 7:45 a.m. to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, including gym, like including PE.
Oh,
And
sure.
if that doesn't underscore just how crazy and how like broken it is, it's like they took something broken and broke it some more.
Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right. Okay, so now you two get to ask one another your burning question. Usually panelists don't get to talk to each other or don't get to ask each other questions. So I love doing this.
I'll start. You know, on our prep call, Brie, you were talking about the people you have on staff, and this is something I wanted to dive into. Do you want to describe sort of the roles of the folks you have, especially, you know, sort of, what was it, the witches in residence? Is that what it's called?
Yeah. Yeah. So in order to like try to think differently about many established structures about how an app or a game is put together, I recruited mostly from outside of the industry. So I have a contemporary artist who's doing game design, a game designer who's new out of school, who did a lot of tend and befriend style projects in her school that maybe weren't so appreciated by the people she was in school with. And we also have 2 witches in residence. And so each of them is someone I met, I think mostly through Instagram, who they're experts in herbalism and various spiritual practices, and kind of both of them have read almost everything there is to read about many of the world's spiritualities and look for connections between them, and can advise on, because we draw from psychology and we draw from social neuroscience, and then through them we can also draw on older forms of knowledge that probably describe the same thing.
How does that translate into the AI then? How do you take that and turn it into like a curve, which people are sort of playing against?
A lot of design work. Yeah. And then iteration and prototyping. Cool. One of the things we've done since the beginning is kind of do a lot of very rapid prototyping and taking it to our target audience and seeing like, what do you think of this? And that's how we discovered that a number of the things, like that the flow state could be different.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, Brie, what's your question to Chethan?
So I was thinking about how when Netflix kind of rose to power and was making their very first series, I could see from the first series that came out, like Frankie and Grace, that it was clear that they were using the data and looking for holes in the market. And Frankie and Grace looked to me like it was like Golden Girls plus AdFab plus maybe something else. And that by looking at big data and looking where the obvious gaps were, Netflix did more for diversity in content and inclusivity in content than a lot of fighting in Hollywood to try to get more fair representation. And I was wondering, since you've had access to see large amounts of data, if you identify any obvious holes in the market that people should be making games in.
You know, I'll go back to my earlier answer about education. I think, you know, framing a game as no one wants to eat their spinach, right? So, you know, but framing it as this is an opportunity to actually grow and learn, I think is a huge opportunity. I say this as a parent also, who's confronted with requests to download all sorts of apps. The latest one was the Looney Tunes game, which I had to go research and see, like, what is this go, you know, what's the point of this thing? And I think the open space is, you know, for all of us in the games industry related to games, the open space is turning a narrative around games, that tend to create violent psychopathic behavior, turn that on its head. And this is sort of what you're doing with your, non-game app, let's say. But it's kind of the same thing, like broaden the narrative and start to talk about, versus sitting slack-jawed like a yokel on a couch watching TV. What are you doing when you play a game? You are active. Your mind is active. You are reacting. And, sure, there's garbage in, garbage out, but I think especially the folks that are on, this conference right now understand, like, the types of things you can get out of games are meaningful. I think the opportunity is to turn it into something meaningful in a way where it doesn't feel like you're eating spinach. It's fun, it's interactive, it's enthralling, and that people generally, when they think about what they've done, they just feel, oh yeah, I feel like I've gotten something from it. And there's plenty of games where we've all gotten a lot out of, but I think we, as the games industry, are kind of on our back heel, kind of defending what this stuff is. Instead, it should be the opposite. We should get on our high horse and clippity-clop around and say, look, this is actually the future, and this is the way that learning, education, growth, social, emotional, soft skills, hard skills, you name it, this is the way it's going to happen. So I think that is the big open space. Not so much specific niches of content, although there's a ton of those out there. I think it's more framing what we do as meaningful and making sure everybody understands that, it's a better alternative to, what came before.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. Everyone in the audience, as you can tell, these two companies, I love them so much. And so, what you've really heard over the course of the last 45 minutes has been a case for taking games into not just change, but also transformation, for, looking at how we can use technology really to really unlock these other elements of our human nature, to really get into our altruism and compassion and our collaboration and all of these things that are as much a part of our composition as competition, as well as then using mirrors so that we can understand ourselves better, putting them into the games, putting them into the interactive experiences, putting them into the technology so that we can, when we have conflicts in games, we can actually use it to understand more about who we are and how we approach conflict. The future of work, the future of society, with the rise and the level of automation and the disruption of current jobs, what's really going to be left is going to be humans being creative together, humans building things together, and humans working together and connecting deeply. And so we need all of these experiences and all of this technology to support us in doing that. Yeah. So thank you so much. That's our last 28 seconds. Thank you for joining us. Deeply appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.